believe in miracles? 1980. Welcome to the 80s. Hard rock on the uptick, new wave kicking it. Some really good stuff came out this year. Let's just jump in. Let's see, January, the Romantics came out, debuted. The Buggles, most well known for being the first thing on MTV, Video Killed the Radio Star. Those guys, if you don't know who they were a couple of really, really great musicians. Trevor Horn, Jeff Downs, bass player and keyboardist. They went on to be involved with Yes, King Crimson. They were in some really, really good bands, and they were some really, really talented players. Not necessarily a huge fan of the Buggles stuff. Some of it was catchy. It was catchy pop kind of stuff. But those guys were, they were fantastic musicians. Rush put out their 7th album, Permanent Waves. Kind of signaled a shift in their style. They were still putting out some of the longer things, but they were shortening their tunes to more radio accessible, I guess. Spirit of Radio, Free Will, Jacob's Ladder, Entre Nous, Different Strings, and the 9+ minute Natural Science, which is a magnificent track. But that whole album is just classic Rush. Some really, really good stuff on that album. Definitely one of my favorites of theirs. The Pretenders burst upon the scene. Chrissie Hynde, James Honeyman Scott. She had been in the music scene for years in London. She was involved with Malcolm McLaren, who produced the Sex Pistols stuff. She was involved with John Lydon, Sid Vicious, just a whole bunch of The Damned, all kinds of different bands, and she never really caught a break. She finally put together this band, the Plasmatics, the Pretenders, and that first album by them, go give it a listen, because it's fantastic. There's some really interesting stuff on that album. She had a condition, let's see if I can remember what it's called. It's kind of like the musical version of but she had a real hard time with timing and phrasing and stuff like that, knowing when to come in, how to put the words to the music in a rhythmic way. And because of that, it produced some really, really interesting stuff. James Honeyman Scott said he had a really hard time integrating into that band because he never knew what they were going to play or when they were going to play it. So he just tried to play over whatever it was they were doing. But this album has Precious, Up the Neck, Space Invader, The Weight, Stop Your Sobbing, Kid, Private Life, Brass in Pocket, Lovers of Today, Mystery Achievement. A really, really good album. Probably my favorite from the Pretenders. Jay Giles came out with Love Stinks. 38 Special, Rockin' Into the Night, another good one. The Babies put out Union Jacks. I think they would put out one more album before they split. The Cure came along. Heart put out an album called Be Strange. It was their 5th album, and their first after their 2 guitar players left. And it's got some good stuff on it too. Be Strange, Silver Wheels, Break, Even It Up, Strange Night, Sweet Darling. There's some good stuff on that album too. The entire album's really good. Classic hard album for me. The Knack came out with their second album. Again, everything I said about them on their first album I think holds true for the second. Really underrated band in my opinion. Seger put out his 11th studio album. Again, recorded in Muscle Shoals. It's got those guys all over it. It's called Against the Wind. And it had that song on it. Had the Horizontal Bop, You'll Accompany Me, Her Strut, Against the Wind, Fire Lake, Betty Lou's Getting Out Tonight. Just some good Seger stuff on that album. Some really good stuff on that album. Survivor popped on the scene. They would go on to get really big in the 80s. Psychedelic Furs, all these new wave bands started popping up. Billy Joel put out Glass Houses. This was the first album I ever bought by Billy Joel. Great way to start an album. That crashing, broken glass. You May Be Right, Sometimes a Fantasy, Don't Ask Me Why, Still Rock and Roll to Me, All for Lena. The rest of the songs are probably mostly unknown. They weren't released as singles, but there's some really good stuff on this album. But that first side is probably one of the outstanding sides of an album that came out in this era. Definitely some good stuff on there. Leppard popped on the scene with On Through the Night. A very raw, rugged sound on that first album, really the first two. But they were coming on strong. They came out of the gate really strong for me. Journey put out Departure. This thing had some good stuff on it too. Any Way You Want It, Walks Like a Lady, Where Were You, Departure, Good Morning Girl, Stay a While. And it was full of good stuff. Kind of skipping over these a little quickly because there's really 4 albums that came out this year that grabbed my attention. Van Halen came out with Women and Children First. This was their first album with no cover songs. And in my opinion, the fewer cover songs they do, the better. Not that there's anything wrong with their cover songs, but And the Cradle Will Rock, Everybody Wants Some, Fools, Romeo Delight, Tora Tora, Lost Control, Lost Control, Lost Control, Lost Control, Take Your Whiskey Home, Could This Be Magic, kind of a campy kind of thing, In a Simple Rhyme, and a little miniature hidden track on there called Growth. It's only like 20 seconds long. But yeah, Women and Children First was a monster album. I had that on vinyl. Genesis put out Duke. They were really starting to transfer into the pop version of Genesis at this point, but that's a good album. There's some good stuff on there. Loverboy came out with their first album. Always liked that band. Joe Perry put out Let the Music Do the Talking after his split with Aerosmith. Air Supply came out. Anne Murray was putting out stuff. It was a really interesting time in music. Judas Priest put out British Steel. This one kind of shifted a direction for them. They went a little bit away from that really heavy metal sound that they had. Not that this stuff is soft or pop by any means, but it was definitely more accessible. Metal Gods, Breaking the Law, Grinder, United, Living After Midnight, Steeler, The Rage. A lot of people point to that album as being their favorite Priest. That same day that came out, a band called Iron Maiden put out their first album. This was before Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith joined the band. I remembered his name this time. Had a singer called Paul Di'Anno. much more raw sounding, less polished than Bruce Dickinson. Great singer for this album. He was on the first two albums, and he was the singer that they needed at that time. Prowler, Running Free, Phantom of the Opera, Sanctuary, Charlotte the Harlot, Iron Maiden. Just some classic Maiden on that album. Fantastic album. So yeah, that day, that was April 14th. That was when the new wave of British heavy metal really took off to me. American punk band put out Los Angeles. What a brutal, hard, heavy, in-your-face album that is. I'm not a huge fan of the punk scene at that time, but that's a notable album. Definitely a notable album. Alice Cooper kind of shifted towards an upbeat, not disco sound, but put out an album called Flush the Fashion. The Dead put out Go to Heaven. It was their first album with Brent Midland, which was really the years of the Dead, especially live, that I really enjoyed more than any other. I love Brent Midland's voice, his writing, his keyboard playing, just some really good stuff in that era for them. Clapton put out the live album Just One Night. Devo put out Freedom of Choice. This is their third album. Probably contains their most popular song, unfortunately. Nothing wrong with the song, it's just what they're known for, Whip It. But it also had Girl You Want, which was covered by Soundgarden, of all people. A really, really good version. Whip It, Snowball, Ton of Love, Freedom of Choice, Gates of Steel, Cold War, That's Pep, Mr. B's Ballroom, Planet Earth. Some fun stuff on that album. I think it's a really good album. Kiss put out the utterly forgettable Unmasked. Peter Gabriel put out his third album. I can't remember what this one was known as. They were all self-titled. This is the one that had that really unique cover. That cover was produced from a photograph, and as the guy was developing the negative, he used a pencil eraser and rubbed up and down on it, and that's what gave it that effect. Another great Peter Gabriel album. It had probably the two big songs that people have heard are Games Without Frontiers and Biko. But yeah, there's some good stuff on that album. I highly suggest you go listen to his entire catalog. The first 8 albums are all, first 8 studio albums are all just great albums. He was such a talented guy. We still had disco kicking it. We had the whole new wave thing still coming on. The Human League, Village People, The Beat, The Cramps. Billy Squier popped up. Accept. Rolling Stones put out Emotional Rescue, which was their second album with Ron Wood. Not nearly as strong as Some Girls to me, and I wouldn't say it's a forgettable album by any means. It's just not it's not in the style that I really like from them. It's got a couple of good songs on there, but overall, it's not my thing. But if it's your thing, more power to you. Huey Lewis and the News put out their first album. They would get huge very shortly after this. Queen put out their 8th album called The Game. This had some popular songs on it, and some really good songs. Play the Game, Another One Bites the Dust, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, Don't Try Suicide, Save Me. Some good stuff on that album. I own that vinyl as well. Ted Nugent put out Scream Dream. Jeff Beck put out There and Back. Johnny Iris, Ultravox, Dexy's Midnight Runners. This was such a unique time for music. Joy Division put out Closer. Not really a fan of their music, and that's just a tragic story of what happened to that singer. But Echo and the Bunnymen. Pat Benatar put out Crimes of Passion. It was her second album, and this sucker took off, man. Probably some of her most popular stuff came from this album. Treat Me Right, You Better Run, Hit Me With Your Best Shot, Hell Is For Children. Some good stuff on that album. She's got a fantastic voice. She is a classically trained singer. And I've heard stuff from her she put out a blues album, like I don't remember when that came out, probably 2004, 3, somewhere in there. But she had such a unique and varying range of not only her voice, but the stuff that she sang. Really good stuff. She's definitely a talented lady. Cars put out Panorama, probably of their first run, probably the weakest album to me. There's good stuff on there. It just didn't have the catchy hooks that some of their other stuff had. Now, there's stuff like that on here, but overall the songs weren't nearly as strong as some of their other stuff. But still some good stuff on there. B-52s, Wild Planet, Jethro Tull, UB40. All these guys were cranking albums out. Paul Simon put out One Trick Pony. There's some good stuff on that album. Really good stuff on that album. Santana put out The Swing of Delight. If you haven't been digging through Santana's catalog, do that. Start at the beginning and just watch that guy progress and change and evolve, and listen to the just absolutely pure music that he put out. Great playing, great tone. Can't say enough about that. John Cougar put out Nothing Matters and What If It Did. I saw him on that tour. David Bowie put out Scary Monsters and Super Creeps. This one is N.J. Piper's pick for this particular year. Scary Monsters, Ashes to Ashes, Fashion, Scream Like a Baby, Teenage Wildlife. There's some good stuff on there, but that era from Bowie was not my favorite. Nothing wrong with it. I just prefer a different era of Bowie. He's one of those bands, or one of those guys, kind of like Rush, or it's another good example of that. Genesis, I think, is a good example of that, in that they transformed through these different styles. They stylistically never stayed the same for too long. He was always looking for something new, always looking to do something different. And I respect that. I think there's some great stuff that he put out that, I mean, you're used to maybe Bowie's Space Oddity kind of stuff or something like that, and he didn't rest on that at all. He just kept putting out stuff that he liked. I enjoy bands that put out stuff that they want to put out, not what's expected of them, and he definitely fits that bill. Boingo Boingo came out this year. Madness. Kansas put out Audio Visions. They would very soon part ways with Steve Walsh and go in a different direction, but there's some good stuff on there. Molly Hatchet, Beating the Odds. Police put out Zenyatta Mendata. It's their third album. And it's got some really popular stuff on it. But this whole album is really good. This is it's between this one and probably Synchronicity that I like the best. Don't Stand So Close to Me, Driven to Tears, Canary in a Coal Mine, Da-do-do-do, Da-da-da-da, Man in a Suitcase. There's just such good stuff on this album. They were a very unique, talented band. Three very talented individuals that came together to create something that was far greater than the sum of its parts. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but you know what I mean. Talking Heads put out Remain in Light, another great Talking Heads album. This thing had some classic stuff on it. I love their I love everything they did up to a point. After around Little Creatures, they started getting too pop for me, but man, they had some good stuff. InXS came along. Dire Straits put out their third album, Making Movies. Go listen to it if you haven't. That's all I'm going to say about that. It's a fantastic album. Springsteen put out The River. Probably one of his more popular, more critically acclaimed albums. It's a little too all over the place for me. There's some good songs on there. He started putting out things that appealed to me a little more around this period. He said that he had learned or realized or something like that there was good and bad, emotionally in the world, that kind of thing. And he didn't want to put out an album that was just focusing on the good or the bad. He wanted to mix them all together. I understand that, but this album it bounces around a little too much for me in that respect. It's not a very cohesive album, and he didn't necessarily intend it to be that way. I think it would have made two better albums than the one album that he put out. U2 popped up on the scene with Bowie, their first album, and you all know where they went from there. I like their early stuff. I like their early stuff more than the Bono pretentiousness era. They were just a basic band back then. The Babies put out On the Edge. Some good John Waite singing and vocals on this album. There's some good stuff on the album in general, but I think they would put out one more album before they split up. He went on to a solo career. Jonathan Cain joined Journey. Yeah, Babies were a good band. Eagles put out Eagles Live. I had a problem with this album. I ordered this from Columbia House Record and Tapes Club. The album came to me. I put it on, ready to rock, and it skipped. I was like, man, scratched all over it. So I sent it back. They sent me a second one. Pulled it out of the sleeve. Scratches all over it. Like, man. Sent that one back. They sent me a third album. The same thing. So I figured that there were no Eagles Live albums that weren't destroyed. So I just put a nickel on the tone arm and listened to it. Yeah, there's some good stuff on there. Seven Bridges Road, probably the highlight of that album for me. Love their version of that song. John Lennon put out Double Fantasy. This was in November 17th. He would be murdered in December. Tragic thing. That album has got too much Yoko influence on it for me. There's some good songs on that album. There's some really good John Lennon songs on that album, but overall, nah. Steely Dan put out Gaucho. I think this might have been, let me make sure here. Yeah, this was the last album they did before they took that incredibly long hiatus. And they were, I think they were tiring of their perfectionism. I guess that's the way I could say it. They used something like 40, 45 musicians on this album. But they were what they were, and they were good at it. Babylon Sisters, Hey 19, Gaucho, Time Out of Mind, My Rival, Third World Man. Just some really good stuff on this album. One of their best, I think. It had some good stuff on it. REO Speedwagon came out with High Infidelity, the career-defining album for them. That thing had some really good stuff on it. It was their 9th album. Keep on Loving You, Take It on the Run, Don't Let Him Go, In Your Letter. It had some good stuff on it. Right around this time, I took a trip to California with my mother. She was out here on a business trip. And they were playing in LA. We were up in San Jose. But it was Westwood One or somebody broadcast that concert live. And I sat out in the rental car and listened to it. And it was good. Good. I liked REO Speedwagon for the most part. Some other interesting stuff that came out. Blondie put out Auto American. Some good Blondie on there. Adam and the Ants came along. Weird story behind them. Elvis Costello put out a compilation album. Clash put out Sandinista. Steve Winwood put out Arc of a Diver. This was the epitome of a solo album. He played every noise that was made on this album himself. The thing about Steve Winwood to me that makes him so enjoyable is he has one of the most pure voices in rock and roll. It is my favorite classic rock voice. Favorite hard rock voice is probably Chris Cornell from Soundgarden, but Steve Winwood's voice is just magnificent. The Blues Brothers put out another live album. The Romantics came along. What else did I want to mention off this list? A girl named Lucinda Williams put out an album called Happy Woman Blues. This was her second album. First one was mostly covers. This one, she wrote everything on it. She would go on to make some of my favorite music, especially in the late 80s, early 90s. She put out some really, really good stuff. Saw her open up for Tom Petty back in the 90s. Very talented. John Prine put out his last album on the record label that had signed him. After that, he started Oh Boy Records, his own label. This album was called Storm Windows. It's got Living in the Future, It's Happening to You, Storm Windows, Baby Ruth, One Red Rose, I Had a Dream. There's some good stuff on that album. He was entering a portion of his career where I think he had kind of somewhat burned out on the music business, and that's why he created his own label. And I think that revitalized him when he did that. But there's some good stuff on that album. Alright, so that's that list. I left 4 albums off of this list. These were the 4 albums that I had to choose from. And I'm not even going to look at the list of them. I'm just going to talk about them. Number 4, these are in order for me. So number 4 of the better albums that came out this year, the best albums, was Motorhead, Ace of Spades. Just an absolutely classic Motorhead album. Some great stuff on that album. Just hard rocking, in your face, classic Motorhead. It's got, I can't remember all the songs on the album. It obviously had the Ace of Spades. But yeah, just some great stuff from Motorhead on that album. I gave it another listen a couple of days ago and was just absolutely rocking, tapping my foot the whole time, just jamming to it. If you haven't heard that, that's a good place to start for Motorhead. It's one of their better albums. The only reason something like that didn't make it to the top of my list is because of the other stuff that was on the list. Number 3 on that list, and it was super difficult to narrow these top 3 albums down to which one was my favorite. This was probably the 3 of the biggest comeback albums that were ever made. 3 of the most unlikely albums that were ever made. Bon Scott died from AC/DC, and they got this singer from a band called Geordie named Brian Johnson, and they put out Back in Black, AC/DC. Name a bad song on that. There's not one. It's just a really good AC/DC album. My favorite is the Bon Scott era, so it's not my favorite album, but it's definitely my favorite album from the Brian Johnson era. I think they sounded more polished on this album than they did before. They were kind of raw and ragged on the other albums. This one is definitely more polished. At the same time, I think it hits harder than anything they ever made. It's just, man, it's just in your face rock and roll. There's some good time stuff on there. You know, You Shook Me All Night Long. But yeah, just an incredible album. Hell's Bells, Back in Black. Some really good stuff on there. And it's hard not to choose an album like that as the best thing that came out that year, because it is one of the best albums that was ever made. Black Sabbath parted ways with Ozzy Osbourne, and they got a singer from Rainbow, Ronnie James Dio, and there were probably a whole bunch of Black Sabbath fans that went, yeah, I don't know about this, and they put on that album, and about 15 seconds into that first song, they went, this might be good, and it was. Heaven and Hell from Black Sabbath. Just an incredibly good album. Ronnie James Dio fit with that band so well, and they changed their style and their approach to album making when he came in. It got much more polished. The songs got more, what's the word I'm looking for? Less loose. They got tighter. His vocals, his writing, everything about it is just magnificent. Tony Iommi's guitar playing seemed to me like it kicked up quite a bit on this album, like he became more polished. A lot of people don't like that era because it was not Paranoid and Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath and stuff like that, and that's understandable. 2 different bands. It's really hard to compare the two. It's like with Bon Scott or Brian Johnson and AC/DC. It's really hard to compare them because they were both so good. You know, Sammy Hagar, David Lee Roth, that whole thing. But Heaven and Hell, from the first note on that album to the last instance of that album, is just a magnificent album. Dio does some stuff on there. There's a term in guitar playing called a double stop, and it's when a line of guitar playing ends, instead of just going, you know, ba-na-na, they'll go da-na, and it gives it that double stop feel. He does that vocally through this album, and where he'll repeat a word, and it's pretty unique, I think. I can't remember anything like that happened before, and he's done it since, done it on some of the Dio stuff and things like that. But yeah, that was just a very interesting thing that caught my ear on that album. But yeah, Heaven and Hell, Black Sabbath, fantastic. Speaking of Black Sabbath, Ozzy left. Everybody probably thought his career was over. He was into drugs. Well, he met this young kid named Randy Rhoads and just fell in love with the guy. They were so enamored of each other, of each other's music, of each other's abilities, songwriting, friends. They developed a great friendship. Ozzy was friends with his mother until she died. Just a really unique relationship, I think, in the music business, that it's hard to say something like that has happened before or since, where two people came together like that and really created something special, something unique. Blizzard of Oz came out. I've done long form reviews of this album before. I did one on Facebook quite a few years ago. I could talk about it for way too long. Needless to say, it is a stellar album. From the very first note to the last, there's only one thing on that album that is like, and that's the song D, the little acoustic classical piece that Randy played. Now, I don't know the story behind that. I know it was written for his mother, Dolores. I imagine Ozzy probably walked in the studio or somewhere and heard him playing that and said, "Hey Randy, that's really cool, we should record that." And that's how that got on the album. He probably just loved it and it made it, but it doesn't fit on that album to me. It's nothing like anything else on the album. That album's got such huge, powerful, monstrous songs on it. It's got some heavy, heavy stuff. It's got some fast, light-hearted rock and roll. It's got unbelievable guitar playing from top to bottom. It's just an unbelievably good album. Definitely my favorite thing that Ozzy ever did. I have a hard time putting it over some of the early Sabbath stuff, but not that hard of a time. Okay. It's my favorite stuff that Ozzy ever did. Those couple of few years where he was together with Randy Rhoads revitalized and invigorated him in a way I don't think anything else could have. He made a career after that based on the comeback that was created with Randy Rhoads. He went through quite a few more guitar players after that, and who knows how many band changes and stuff like that. And I think the success of that album and the one that followed it put enough energy into that man to last him for the rest of his life. When Randy died, it took a lot of energy out of him. It hurt him bad. But there was enough there that he was able to carry on. And I think he carried on because of Randy Rhoads. I don't think he wanted to let him down in some weird way. But, yeah, great stuff. Blizzard of Oz, Ozzy Osbourne, Album of the Year, 1980. There you have it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think of my list. I'll be back soon with 1981, and we'll see where we go from there. Thanks for watching.